Hello, coders. This video is going to answer some questions, common questions about our invoice generation program, as well as offer you some coding hints and strategies that you can use in your own program. We're going to start here with our client class. I'd like you to notice that our client class is relatively short. A couple imports at the top, and then only about 35 lines of code. Inside of our main method, we start by calling a class method in the utility class. So utility is what we're using to access this method. Display invoice header. We'll take a look at that method in just a moment. Then we declare and initialize a customer first name string and a customer last name string. Notice that both of these are also calling class methods in the utility class. These clearly are returning string values. Notice that each of these has an argument, first and last, that is passed to the method. Next, we have another class level method, get date and time, also accessed with the utility class. And then finally here on line 23, we are instantiating our first object using the customer class. Notice on the right side of the equal sign, we're calling the constructor for the customer class, and we are passing two arguments, so that at the time a new customer is instantiated, it's going to receive these two pieces of information. By contrast, on line 25, when we instantiate an order object, notice the call to that class's constructor does not have any values inside the parentheses. There are no arguments passed. So we're essentially starting with a blank order. We could pass data values here if we wanted to. Up here with our customer constructor, we could pass more or less arguments. That's totally up to the developer. On line 27, we declare and initialize a Boolean flag that's going to be used to flag whether the customer is done ordering new items and is ready to move on to their cart and checkout, or if they'd like to continue adding items to their cart. Here is a do-while loop. Remember, a do-while loop is handy because it is always guaranteed to iterate once. And then as it iterates, it calls an object level method in the order class called display catalog, and calls another object level method, prompt for additional purchases, and it will keep doing that, displaying the catalog and prompting for purchases until our flag in this control expression turns false and stops the while loop from iterating. Please notice the logic here. There is a semicolon negation. So as long as the customer is not ready to view the cart and check out, it will keep iterating over and over. After the customer is done ordering items and is ready to check out, we call another object level method called viewCart. And then finally, we have a printout here of a few values. This is not really necessary, but it's meant to show you that by saving data to variables like customer first name, customer last name, you can then print these values anytime you need to, including your customer ID number, which is returned by a method. We'll take a look at those methods in just a moment. So let's jump now to our utility class. Our utility class does not have a constructor, and that's because all of our methods in the utility class are static methods, which allows us to access them directly by the name of the class, utility.displayInvoiceHeader, for example. Here I've taken a little bit of a shortcut. When I was switching back and forth between home and school, I was tired of changing my code. So here on line 11, you'll see the file path used to access my invoice logo when I am at home. Down here on line 14, I have a similar file path for when I'm at school. If I need to switch back and forth, I can just comment that line, remove these comment marks, and I'm good to go. Right, inside this method, we have some familiar code from a recent lesson on how to retrieve data from a text file. So that should seem familiar. You're welcome to pause the video here if you'd like to take a closer look at this code. Scrolling down, we have another method here. This method is designed to get and validate a name. Notice that it has a single parameter here, first or last. We saw in the client class how sometimes we pass first and sometimes we pass last, and those different arguments allow us to customize our prompt for the first name or the last name. Here is the do while loop that handles the validation. Again, notice our logic here. We have a negation. As long as it's not a valid name, this do while loop will keep iterating and asking the user to type in a valid name. Another method here, this is our get date and time method. Please notice it's using an object instantiated by the date format class. That's a pretty specialized class, and if you scroll up to the top of this utility method, which we'll do in a moment, you can see the imports I use there. You can find all this with a quick Google search, especially using Stack Overflow, one of my favorite websites. We'll look at one more method here in the utility class. Here is another check and validation method. It has a single string argument here, or parameter I should say, that receives an argument. And it has another Boolean flag. This one starts out as true. It's going to check to see if a string is empty or if the string starts with a negative sign. Either of those would be an indicator that we have an improper or invalid quantity. We don't want them to send us an empty string or a negative value, in which case we would turn our flag to false. Else, we're going to use this for loop to iterate through the string and check to see if any of the digits are letters or digits. And then if they are all digits and it is a non-negative integer, then we can now parse that integer, or parse that string as an integer, I should say, and then return the quantity. So there is our check if valid quantity method. We'll jump now to our customer class. Our customer class at this point is quite short. So this is our first class with a constructor. It's going to be constructing objects that will be used to access object level methods. Up at the top here, we have 3 data fields. They're all private. We want to keep our data as private as possible and as secure as possible. Customer first name, customer last name, and a customer ID. Moving down now to our constructor. Again, notice our constructor always has the same name as our class, customer here. This constructor has 2 parameters. This is how we pass data from our client class or any other location directly to this constructor when we want to construct a new customer. Again, we don't have to pass parameters here. We can have an empty set of parentheses, or we could have more parameters if we wanted to pass more information than just the customer's first or last name. We might even pass their address at this point. That's totally up to you. But for now, we're just passing 2 values, and those values are used to initialize our data fields. Notice there's a third statement here. This statement is going to set the customer ID by calling this method, set customer ID, which is defined below. This is not exactly the same as the customer ID directions in your project, but close enough to be helpful. This is going to use a for loop to iterate through all characters of the customer's last name. It's going to find the value of each of those characters, specifically the ASCII value, and it's going to total all of those up into the sum of characters. Then the customer's ID is going to be defined as their first initial of their first name, their first initial of the last name, and then a dash, and then the sum of characters. You'll see that run in just a moment. Finally, we're going to jump over to our order class. This is a pretty heavy-duty class. It's got most of our methods. In our order class, we have quite a few data values at the top. We have instance fields for the item numbers as an array, item descriptions, item unit prices. Notice that all 3 of those are defined as final. They're constants. We don't expect those to change during runs of our program. However, the next 2 data fields are not marked as final. These will change as the customer is placing their order. Quantities and line totals will change. Here's our constructor of the order class. Notice again that this constructor does not have any parameters. We're basically starting with a blank order. We don't need to pass any data. However, we are going to ask our constructor to initialize our two arrays